She was just walking home when two police officers threw her to the ground and pressed her head against the pavement. They thought they would get away with it, but a minute later, her husband, Chuck Norris, arrived, and then began something they would never forget. Subscribe, hit like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun lingered over the quiet suburb of Tyler, Texas, laying down a warm amber glow on the neatly kept lawns and wide streets. Sprinklers ticked and hissed in the distance. Children's laughter echoed faintly from backyards, and the smell of barbecues drifted in the air like a reminder of how ordinary life was supposed to be here. To anyone who glanced across the block, this was a picture of safety, a slice of American calm where nothing dangerous could ever intrude. But safety has a way of vanishing in a single heartbeat, and on this evening, the illusion would be torn apart. Gina O'Kelly, the wife of Chuck Norris, walked lightly along the sidewalk with the grace of someone who took comfort in routine. Her blonde hair was tied back, her sports bag over her shoulder after a late yoga class, and a faint smile touched her lips as she thought of returning home. In her mind were the simple domestic concerns of a wife: what to cook for dinner, whether Chuck had finished fixing the old fence by the driveway, whether she should remind him to call their son. She had grown used to the tranquility of their neighborhood, the certainty that no harm could cross these quiet streets. Her husband's name might have carried a shadow of legend in the world outside, but here she was, just Gina, a woman enjoying a calm evening, never imagining the violence waiting just ahead. At the far end of the street, parked at a skewed angle that instantly disturbed the picture of order, a black and white police cruiser sat idling. Its engine was off, but its presence was wrong, like a predator crouching in the tall grass. The front doors were already open, and leaning casually against the car were two uniformed officers. Their names were Grant Miller and Derek Holt. They did not stand with the posture of guardians, nor with the discipline of men serving the law. Instead, their weight rested in slouches, arms crossed, eyes sharp with arrogance and hunger for power. In their smirks was the look of men who craved dominance over anyone weaker, the type who mistook fear for respect. Gina noticed them only when she drew closer to her house, her sneakers crunching softly against the pavement. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police cars sometimes passed through, though rarely with such an air of idleness. She kept her pace steady, shifting her bag on her shoulder. Then Miller's voice sliced through the air, deep and mocking. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Gina slowed, confused, and looked around, her brows knitting. "Are you talking to me?" "Yeah, I'm talking to you," Miller said, pushing himself off the cruiser and strolling toward her with a deliberate swagger. Holt followed a step behind, his hand casually brushing the baton at his belt. "I live here," Gina said quickly, gesturing toward her house just a few yards away. "What's the problem?" "We got a report," Holt sneered, his eyes raking over her. "Suspicious woman in the area. Matches your description." "That's ridiculous," she answered, a sharp edge of fear cutting through her words. "I told you, I live here. My husband and I—" "Save it," Miller interrupted, his grin widening as if her resistance amused him. "We've heard that story before. Doesn't work." Her pulse quickened, her throat tightening. She took a step back, moving instinctively toward the safety of her home. But they closed in, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Gina said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady, "but you need to leave me alone." Miller lunged forward suddenly. His hand shot out, seizing her arm with brutal strength. He twisted it behind her back, forcing her into a painful angle. Gina gasped, the sting shooting up her shoulder. "Let me go!" she cried, her voice carrying across the street. "Resisting arrest?" Miller mocked, tightening his grip. "Not a good idea, lady." Holt moved in, his lips curling into a cruel smile. With a swift kick, he knocked her legs out from beneath her, sending her crashing onto the asphalt. Her knees scraped, skin tearing, blood smearing across the concrete. The shock jolted through her body, and before she could rise, Miller's knee pressed heavily against her spine, pinning her face toward the ground. "Stop resisting," he barked, though she wasn't fighting at all. "I'm not resisting. You're hurting me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. But Holt crouched lower, his hand pressing the back of her neck as he slammed her forehead against the pavement. Pain exploded in her skull, a warm trickle of blood sliding down her temple. "You'll learn respect," Holt hissed into her ear. Miller chuckled darkly. You just ruined your evening, lady. The words cut deep, as if cruelty itself was their goal. Gina tried to move, to pull her face away from the rough ground, but Holt's boot suddenly pressed against the side of her head, grinding it into the asphalt. The humiliation was worse than the pain. She whimpered, feeling the grit and blood against her cheek, the weight of merciless power crushing her spirit. Across the street, curtains twitched. Neighbors had heard the commotion, glimpsed the scene from behind their safe windows. But fear kept them hidden. Not one dared step outside. The silence of the block was filled only with her cries, the laughter of the men, and the sound of her body struggling helplessly. And then, faint but unmistakable, another sound drifted down the street, the growl of an approaching engine. It rolled low and steady, carrying with it a different kind of weight. Miller and Holt barely noticed it first, but Gina heard it, her heart sparking with a desperate hope. She knew that sound. She knew that truck. The roar grew louder, the headlights slicing across the street. A dark-colored pickup pulled onto the block, its tires rolling slow, its presence heavier than the cruiser itself. The vehicle came to a stop just a few feet away, and silence followed. The driver's door opened. From the cab stepped Chuck Norris. He emerged with a calmness that was more frightening than rage, his figure broad and steady under the fading sun. His boots touched the pavement with unhurried certainty, each step echoing as if the world itself hushed to listen. He took in the sight before him, his wife, her face pressed against the ground, her temple bleeding, her body pinned beneath the weight of two men who thought themselves invincible. His eyes hardened, and in them there was no panic, no rush of wild anger, only a cold, controlled fury that promised retribution. Take your hands off my wife. His voice carried across the street like distant thunder, low and commanding. The words froze Miller in place. Holt's smirk faltered, his foot still pressing against Gina's head. For the first time that evening, hesitation crept into their posture. Gina felt the relief like a wave, even as pain throbbed in her skull. She knew that voice. She had heard it years ago in Tokyo, when a gang of thugs had thought to corner them in an alley, only to be dismantled by the man she married. She knew what was coming. She knew her tormentors had just made a catastrophic mistake. And as Chuck drew closer, his eyes never leaving the two men, the air itself seemed to thicken, the peace of the neighborhood shattering in anticipation of violence that had not yet begun, but was already inevitable. The air on the street seemed to stop moving when the words left Chuck's mouth. It was not a shout nor a desperate cry, but a calm statement, as if he were announcing a truth that could not be avoided. His boots touched the pavement with the weight of inevitability, and every step forward brought a deeper silence. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the neighborhood, and in that dimming light his presence carried the weight of judgment. Grant Miller tried to laugh, though the sound came out brittle and forced. Your wife was resisting arrest, he said, his grip on Gina's arm tightening as though to prove he still held control. Derek Holt shifted his stance, his boot pressing harder against her head, his lips pulling into a sneer. Yeah, that's right. She fought us. You better stand back, old man, unless you want the same treatment. Chuck's eyes flicked briefly to Gina. Her cheek was against the rough asphalt, blood trickling along the curve of her temple, her body trembling. She met his gaze through the haze of pain, and in that look passed both her relief and her plea. His jaw tightened. Slowly he raised his eyes back to the two officers, and when he spoke again, his voice was granite. Stand up, Gina. She tried to move, but Holt shoved harder with his boot. Oh yeah? Holt said, puffing his chest with false bravado. And what if we don't let her up? His tone was mocking, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something uneasy that betrayed his act. Miller tried to cover it with bravado, leaning closer and smirking. You threatening the law, Norris? Chuck tilted his head, his movements fluid and precise even in stillness. His voice came out sharp as a blade. Not a threat, a promise. Holt laughed, but the sound was nervous, like a gambler bluffing with an empty hand. We've heard that before. He pulled his baton from his belt, twirling it with an exaggerated flourish. This is how it works. You stand down, and we don't put you in the hospital next to her. Gina closed her eyes for a moment. whispering through the sting in her lips. "Chuck, don't." But she stopped herself because she remembered. She remembered nights in Tokyo when he had walked her through narrow streets, the way his stillness made entire groups of predators hesitate. She remembered that tone of voice, quiet and cold, that always came before the storm. And she knew that no matter how much fear burned inside her, Chuck would not allow these men to walk away with what they had done. Chuck stepped closer. His hands hung loose at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his breath calm. He moved like water flowing toward a cliff's edge, unstoppable, inevitable. Miller felt the air grow heavier. He tried to hide it, gripping his baton tighter, but the sweat on his palm betrayed him. "Last chance," Chuck said softly, his eyes piercing through them. "Take your hands off my wife." Miller barked a laugh, though it cracked at the edges. "You don't scare me. You're just a washed-up movie star. You think people care about you here? You think this is one of your films? This is real life." Chuck's expression didn't change. "That's why you should be afraid." The tension coiled so tight around them, it was like a bowstring ready to snap. Holt shifted, trying to steady himself, his foot still pressing Gina's head to the ground. He wanted to speak, but his mouth had gone dry. He saw the way Norris was looking at him, not with anger, but with something worse. Calm certainty. "Fine," Miller snarled, raising his baton. "Let's see what you've got." He stepped forward quickly, swinging the baton in a hard arc aimed at Chuck's ribs. But before the strike could land, Chuck moved. His body slipped into the attack with precision born of endless training, his hands snapping up to catch Miller's wrist in mid-swing. With a precise twist, he rotated the joint sharply, disarming Miller and sending the baton clattering across the asphalt. In the same seamless motion, Chuck's palm shot forward, striking Miller square in the chest. The impact sent him flying backward against the patrol car, his breath exploding out in a choked gasp as his body crumpled against the metal hood. Holt's eyes widened. He tore his boot from Gina's head and ripped his taser from his belt. With a flick of his wrist, the prongs snapped out, crackling with electricity. He lunged forward, aiming for Chuck's chest. But Chuck's hand moved faster. He struck the nerve line in Holt's wrist with pinpoint accuracy, the jolt of pain forcing his fingers open. The taser fell uselessly to the pavement. "You slammed my wife's head against the ground," Chuck said, his voice like ice as he stepped closer. His hands shot out, gripping Holt by the throat with iron force, while the other seized his belt. With a surge of strength, he lifted the man off his feet and hurled him down onto the asphalt. Holt hit the ground with a sickening thud, the air rushing from his lungs in a wheeze. Miller staggered up, still clutching his chest, his face twisted with fury and disbelief. He charged again, roaring, but Chuck flowed low, sidestepping with effortless grace. His elbow drove sharply into Miller's ribs, the crack of impact echoing. Miller gasped, stumbling forward, and before he could recover, Chuck spun him and slammed his cheek hard against the patrol car's hood. One powerful arm pinned him there like steel. "A badge doesn't make you untouchable," Chuck said softly into Miller's ear, his voice steady and unforgiving. "It makes you responsible." Holt groaned on the ground, trying to push himself up. Chuck turned his head slowly toward him, eyes cutting through the distance. "Stay down." The command struck like a blow. Holt froze, his body obeying before his mind caught up, fear rooting him in place. Miller, his cheek pressed to the hood, whimpered through gritted teeth. "Unashamed," he muttered weakly. "Unashamed." Chuck pressed harder. "Say it properly." "Unashamed," Miller gasped again, the last of his arrogance crushed. Chuck released him suddenly, stepping back with quiet authority. "Get in your car," he said, "and leave. Don't let me see you near the street again." Miller staggered to his feet, grabbing Holt by the arm. Both men scrambled desperately into the cruiser, their dignity shattered, their breath ragged. The engine roared to life, and in seconds the car sped down the street, vanishing into the shadows. Chuck turned immediately, dropping to one knee beside Gina. His hands, gentle now, touched her face carefully, wiping away the blood. His voice softened in a way only she ever heard. "Are you all right?" Her voice was weak, trembling. "It hurts, but I'll be okay." He looked into her eyes, his fierce edge fading to warmth. "They won't come back." A faint, trembling smile touched her lips. "I know what happens to people who make you angry." He let out a quiet chuckle, though his eyes still scanned the street, the horizon, the shadows where threats might hide. Around them, curtains that had twitched closed remained shut. Neighbors who had seen everything pretended they hadn't. Silence fell again over the block, but it was a silence poisoned with fear and the scent of blood on the pavement. Chuck helped Gina to her feet with the gentleness of a man who knew his strength could heal as easily as it could destroy. She leaned against him, her knees shaking, her breath sharp from the adrenaline. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders, steady and protective. Inside the house, as he settled her on the couch and pressed an ice pack to her temple, he kept his eyes shifting from window to window. He didn't pace, he didn't fidget, but his stillness was that of a predator waiting, sensing the world with instincts honed over decades of violence. His calmness was not peace, it was preparation. And in that quiet, with the sound of Gina's unsteady breathing filling the room, Chuck knew what his wife had whispered was true. They might have left, but they would come back. Predators rarely retreated for long. The house had grown quiet after the confrontation on the street, but the silence was the kind that carried tension, not peace. Gina sat on the couch with a damp cloth pressed gently to her bruised forehead. Her eyes closed as she tried to steady her breathing. Chuck had not left her side, though his body gave away no signs of fatigue. He sat in the chair opposite her, his gaze moving from window to window, every sense awake as though expecting the echo of a car engine to break the stillness again. His calm demeanor did not fool Gina. She knew that calm came from discipline, and that beneath it coiled the readiness to fight again if necessary. She tried to smile, though her lips trembled. "You didn't have to go that far," she whispered. He turned his eyes toward her, and there was a softness there, but his reply was quiet steel. "They pressed your face into the ground. That was already too far." Outside, the last rays of daylight faded, giving way to a pale moon. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. The neighborhood seemed deserted, the windows still drawn, as though the entire block had collectively decided to pretend nothing had happened. It angered Gina, though she understood the fear that kept them hidden. Still, the betrayal of silence cut deep. As night deepened, she dozed uneasily on the couch, while Chuck remained awake, his body still and his mind racing. He replayed every detail of the encounter in his head, the way Holt had pressed her head into the pavement, the smirk on Miller's lips, the hollow arrogance in their voices. Those men had not been enforcing the law. They had been feeding their own egos, and men like that never stopped at one humiliation. They would lick their wounds, call it pride, and come back hungrier. Chuck knew their type. He had seen them in uniforms and in gangs, in alleys and in offices, and they all shared the same mistake. They underestimated the cost of crossing the line. He rose quietly, moving into the kitchen. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. He poured himself a glass of water, staring out at the empty street. It looked calm, almost too calm, and his instincts told him that calm was only the mask that comes before the storm. The hours stretched. Midnight passed, then 1. At last, near 2 in the morning, the low hum of an engine broke the stillness. Chuck's head turned instantly toward the window. He set the glass down without a sound and moved back to the living room. Gina stirred as if sensing his tension. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still weak. "Stay inside," he said, his tone flat and commanding. He stepped to the window, parted the curtain a fraction, and looked out. A sedan rolled slowly into view, its headlights off, moving with predatory caution. It came to a stop across the street, and 2 figures stepped out. Even in the pale moonlight, Chuck recognized them immediately. Grant Miller and Derek Holt, this time without uniforms, but their arrogance had not lessened. Miller carried a steel pipe that glinted under the street lamp, and Holt twirled a knife in his hand as though it were a toy. Chuck's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. He muttered under his breath, "Idiots." He walked to the door and opened it quietly, stepping out onto the porch. He closed the door behind him with deliberate softness, his silhouette tall and immovable against the house. Miller spotted him first and grinned, though the grin was strained. Well, look who's here, Miller sneered. Thought you could humiliate us and just walk away? Chuck didn't answer immediately. His silence pressed heavier than any insult. Holt smirked, waving the knife lazily. Tonight we finish what we started. Chuck's voice, when it came, was calm as a frozen lake. Your first mistake was coming back here. Your second mistake was thinking I'd let you touch her again. You won't get a chance at a third. The words struck them harder than a fist. Miller snarled and raised the pipe. Big talk, old man. He charged, swinging the pipe in a wide arc toward Chuck's head. Chuck's body flowed like water. He stepped inside the swing, his hands snapping out to catch the pipe near its base. With a sharp twist, he ripped it free from Miller's grip. The movement was so fast it seemed almost casual. Then with the same fluid motion, he rammed the end of the pipe into Miller's ribs. The crack echoed down the street, and Miller staggered back, choking on his breath as the weapon clattered to the ground. Holt roared and lunged forward with the knife, his eyes wide with rage. He thrust the blade toward Chuck's chest, but Chuck pivoted, stepping aside with grace that came from 1,000 repetitions of the movement. His hand shot out, clamping down on Holt's wrist, twisting it into a joint lock that sent searing pain through the man's arm. Holt screamed as the knife slipped from his fingers, falling uselessly to the porch. Chuck used Holt's own momentum against him, sweeping his legs and slamming him down onto the ground. Holt hit hard, the breath knocked out of him in a single wheeze. Miller tried to recover, staggering forward to snatch up the pipe again, but Chuck was already moving. He dropped low, driving his elbow into Miller's stomach with surgical precision. Miller folded over with a guttural groan. Chuck seized him by the shirt and slammed him against the porch railing, pinning him with effortless strength. This is what you don't understand, Chuck said, his voice low, his face inches from Miller's. Violence isn't your tool, it's mine, and you're not ready for what that means. Holt groaned on the ground, clutching his wrist, trying to push himself up. In desperation, he grabbed a chair from the porch and swung it clumsily. Chuck ducked beneath the arc, drove his shoulder into Holt's chest and launched him backward. Holt landed flat on the dirt, coughing violently. Chuck stepped over him, his movements controlled, precise, like a man who wasted no effort. Miller, still pinned, squirmed with rage. Chuck let him drop, and the man collapsed to the porch steps beside his partner, both of them beaten and gasping. Chuck stood above them, tall and immovable, the steel pipe lying discarded at his feet. His voice carried the weight of judgment, final and unyielding. The first time I let you walk away, he said, that was mercy. This is your warning. If you come back again, you will not walk away at all. Neither man replied. Their pride had evaporated, replaced with naked fear. They struggled to their feet, dragging each other back toward the car. The sedan's engine coughed, then roared, carrying them off into the night as quickly as they had come. Chuck remained on the porch, his breathing steady, his body relaxed as though the fight had cost him nothing. He watched the taillights vanish into the dark horizon, the silence folding back around the neighborhood like a curtain. Behind him, the door creaked. Gina stood in the frame, pale and shaken, but her eyes steady. She had seen enough to know he had driven them away again, though her fear told her it would not be the last time. Chuck turned to her, his expression softening. He stepped closer and touched her cheek with the gentleness of a man who knew exactly how fragile peace was. They'll remember, she said quietly, her voice trembling but sure. That was the point, he replied. His gaze, however, stayed fixed on the shadows at the end of the street. He knew men like Miller and Holt never acted alone. Their arrogance came from somewhere deeper, from someone pulling the strings in the dark. And as he stood there with his wife clinging to him, Chuck understood this was no longer about two corrupt officers with bruised egos. This was about something larger, something that would not stop until it was confronted head-on. The night after the second confrontation stretched into uneasy silence. Chuck barely slept, his body resting in the chair near the living room window, while Gina lay curled on the couch with a blanket pulled over her. The swelling on her forehead had gone down only slightly, but the memory of her humiliation remained raw. Chuck's eyes moved from window to door to shadow, calm but vigilant. He knew the fight wasn't over. Men like Miller and Holt didn't retreat out of respect. They retreated to lick their wounds, to call someone stronger, and to plan revenge. When dawn broke, the neighborhood began its routine as if nothing had happened. Sprinklers hissed across lawns, children rode their bicycles down the sidewalks, and neighbors smiled at one another in that superficial way suburban streets often did. But behind closed doors, whispers circulated. Everyone had seen the video. Someone's phone camera had captured it, shaky and grainy but unmistakable. Chuck dismantling two officers with calm brutality, standing over them like a verdict in human form. By mid-morning, the clip was already online, first shared quietly among neighbors, then spreading across social media. The captions were breathless, sensational. They pushed Chuck Norris too far. Two cops learn a painful lesson. He protected his wife with his bare hands. Gina saw the footage later that day, played on a local news broadcast. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. The reporter's voice spoke of an altercation between two officers and a local resident, carefully worded, dancing around the details. But the video itself told the truth. It showed her pinned to the ground, Miller's knee digging into her back, Holt grinding her face against the asphalt. It showed Chuck's calm entrance, his voice cutting the air, and then the swift, precise movements that turned the men from predators into broken shells scrambling for their car. The clip ended with him helping her to her feet. Blood streaked across her face, but her hand gripping his arm with trust. "They're going to come back," she said softly, her voice heavy with certainty. Chuck turned from the sink where he had been rinsing a glass. His eyes met hers, steady and calm. "I know." The internet buzzed louder with every hour. In Mexico and Colombia, fans reposted the clip with captions calling him El Protector. Comment sections filled with praise. Some hailed him as a knight defending his wife. Others wrote that he was proof justice could still exist when the system failed. To strangers, he was a symbol. To Gina, he was her husband, the man she had married, and the man who carried the burden of every battle like a scar in his soul. She worried not about the attention, but about the storm it would draw. Fame was a beacon, and predators were always drawn to light. By evening, Chuck sat in his study, the small lamp casting a dim glow over his notebook. It was an old habit of his to record details, names, times, patterns. He wrote out Miller and Holt, circled their names, and drew a line to another name he remembered from whispers in his past. Victor Salazar, a broker, a fixer, the kind of man who dealt in shadows. Chuck didn't have proof yet, but he trusted his instincts. These two men weren't acting out of simple pride anymore. Someone bigger was moving them, someone feeding their arrogance. The following morning, the first sign arrived. Gina stepped out to fetch the mail, her face still pale from the bruises, her steps hesitant. She opened the box expecting bills and junk advertisements. Instead, among the envelopes lay a plain, unmarked one. She frowned, slid her finger under the flap, and pulled out a single photograph. Her stomach dropped. It was a picture of her, taken the day before, walking toward the market with her tote bag. The angle was long, distant, taken with a telephoto lens. On the back, in red marker, were 4 words. "We can reach her anytime." Her hands trembled as she carried it inside, her heart thundering. Chuck was in the living room, fixing the lock on the back window. She placed the photo on the table. He saw it, his jaw tightening as he picked it up. His face didn't change, but a cold fire burned in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Nothing I can't handle," he said softly, slipping the photograph into his pocket. He did not show her the message written on the back. She had endured enough. He would not let her carry this weight. That afternoon, he told her he was going for supplies. Instead, he drove across town to a place he knew too well. The Red Crow, a dim bar with nicotine-stained walls and a reputation for drawing off-duty cops with dirty hands. He parked the truck down the block and entered quietly, moving like a shadow into the smoke-filled room. He chose a corner table and ordered a beer he never intended to drink. He sat with stillness, his eyes scanning. It didn't take long. Miller and Holt walked in, their bodies bruised, their dignity shattered, but their arrogance unbroken. With them sat a thinner man with slicked-back hair and a scar cutting through his eyebrow. Victor Salazar, Chuck had heard his name years ago, whispered by men who dealt in corruption. Salazar wasn't a thug. He was a bridge between uniforms and crime, the man who connected desperate officers to powerful benefactors. Chuck watched silently as the three leaned close at a table. Their voices were low, but their gestures told enough. Miller slammed his fist into his palm, his mouth twisting with anger. Holt sneered and mimed a knife thrust. Salazar listened, nodding with sharp eyes, his expression calculating. Chuck's hand slid to his phone. Angling it subtly, he recorded the scene, catching their faces, their postures, their conspiracy. After half an hour, Salazar rose and left the table. Chuck waited a moment, then followed. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold. Salazar moved quickly toward a waiting black sedan, his steps purposeful. Chuck paused long enough to memorize the license plate before the car disappeared into the shadows. Later that night, back at home, Chuck sat at his desk with his old black notebook. He called in a favor to a man he trusted, someone with access to records not meant for public eyes. Within hours, the reply came back. The sedan belonged to Victor Salazar, and Salazar's ties led directly to a name Chuck had hoped never to see again. Ramon Vasquez, a disgraced police chief, expelled years ago for corruption, now running his empire from the shadows. Gina found him hunched over the notebook, the lamp's light etching lines of focus on his face. He looked up when she entered, her figure framed in the doorway, her eyes steady despite her fear. "Who is it?" she asked. Chuck reached into his pocket, pulled out the photograph, and placed it face down on the desk. For a long moment she stared at it before turning it over. Her eyes darkened, but she did not flinch. "So what do we do?" He met her gaze with quiet resolve. "We stop them. But when I tell you to move, you move. No hesitation." She nodded, the trust between them unshaken, stronger than fear itself. That night, as the wind rattled faintly against the windows and the neighborhood lay in its false calm, Chuck Norris sat awake, his mind sharpened to a single point. The battle was no longer with two corrupt officers. It had become a war with the shadowed hands that had empowered them. And he knew that war had only just begun. The discovery of Ramon Vasquez's name changed everything. For Chuck, it was no longer a matter of two disgraced officers nursing their wounded pride. Miller and Holt were pawns, puppets whose strings had always been in someone else's hand. That hand belonged to Vasquez, and Vasquez had never been a man to let humiliation rest. Gina saw the weight settle across her husband's shoulders in the days after the photo arrived, though he never spoke of it directly. She watched him move through the house with sharpened stillness, checking locks twice, pausing at windows longer than usual, his eyes following every car that slowed near their street. She knew he was already preparing, and though fear tightened her chest, she trusted him enough not to question the plan that was forming silently inside his mind. The video of the fight had made Chuck a symbol online. El Protector, some called him, a guardian figure risen from the screen into the real world. To strangers, it was a legend, something to share and celebrate. But to the men who had been exposed by that lens, it was fuel for vengeance. Chuck could feel it in the air, like the still heaviness before a storm. Miller and Holt were no longer dangerous alone, but with Vasquez behind them, they would come back, this time with more than bruised egos and cheap weapons. And when they came, it would not be to intimidate, it would be to destroy. He drove across town one evening to meet an old friend, Javier, a man who had fought beside him in shadows the public never knew existed. Javier was bent over the hood of a rusted pickup when Chuck found him, wiping grease from his hands. They didn't need many words. Javier saw the look in his old comrade's eyes and knew the weight of it. Chuck told him only enough. Miller, Holt, Salazar, Vasquez. Javier's jaw tightened, but he gave a slow nod. "You'll need eyes and ears," he said, "and a way to make them come to you." Chuck agreed. It was better to draw them into his ground than wait for them to strike at his home again. That night, back in his study, he used a disposable phone. His voice was disguised in vagueness, but the message was clear enough for it to reach the ears it needed to. Norris would be at the city park at dusk, walking alone, unarmed. It was bait, and Chuck knew they would not be able to resist. The day passed in strange quiet. Gina busied herself with small chores, though her eyes flicked constantly toward the windows, searching for shadows. Chuck remained calm, his body loose, his breathing steady, though his mind traced every angle of what was to come. When the hour drew near, he kissed her softly at the door. "Stay here," he said, his tone low but final. She clutched his hand, her eyes wet but fierce. "Just come back to me," she whispered. He nodded once, then left, the truck rolling away into the falling sun. The city park was nearly empty by dusk, the trees casting long, dark lines across the cracked paths, the fountain in the center murmuring softly. Chuck stood beneath an oak tree, his figure blending into the growing shadows. His breathing was slow, his eyes scanning. He was not tense. Tension wasted energy. He was ready, each muscle loose but alert, his mind already mapping the fight that would inevitably come. It did not take long. A sedan pulled into the lot, its headlights off. The doors opened, and 3 figures stepped out. Miller, Holt, and Victor Salazar. They moved like men who believed the night belonged to them. Miller carried a length of steel pipe. Holt gripped a knife whose blade glinted faintly in the dying light, and Salazar walked behind them, his hand near the bulge under his jacket where a pistol waited. "Well, well," Miller called out, his voice echoing across the empty park. "Look who's stupid enough to show his face again." Chuck didn't move, his calm more terrifying than aggression. "You made 2 mistakes already," he said. "Tonight you'll make your last." Holt grinned, spinning the knife in his fingers. Big words from a washed-up old man. He lunged forward, thrusting the blade toward Chuck's chest. Chuck stepped aside with fluid grace, his hand snapping out to seize Holt's wrist. A sharp twist sent pain shooting through the man's arm, and the knife fell uselessly to the ground. Chuck pivoted, sweeping Holt's legs from under him and driving him down onto the concrete. Holt cried out as his breath exploded from his lungs. Miller roared and charged, swinging the pipe in a brutal arc. Chuck's arm shot up, intercepting the strike. He grabbed the pipe near its base, twisted sharply, and wrenched it from Miller's grip. In one smooth counter, he slammed the end of it into Miller's ribs. The crack echoed, and Miller stumbled back, gasping, clutching his side. Salazar cursed and drew his pistol, raising it toward Chuck. But Chuck moved before the man could steady his aim. He surged forward, closing the distance in a blur. His hand struck Salazar's wrist with pinpoint precision, the gun flying from his grasp. Chuck grabbed his collar and slammed him hard against a tree, the bark crunching under the impact. "Who's behind this?" Chuck demanded, his voice a growl. Salazar's eyes darted wildly, sweat dripping down his face. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he spat. "The boss doesn't forgive." Chuck pressed him harder into the tree. "Name him." Salazar's mouth trembled, but the word broke free anyway. "Vasquez." The name hung in the air like a sentence. Miller groaned on the ground, Holt clutching his twisted wrist, and Salazar pinned, his arrogance stripped away. Chuck let the man drop, unconscious, to the dirt. He looked down at the broken trio and spoke with the weight of a final warning. "The first time was mercy. This was your chance. If you come near my wife again, there will be nothing left for you." He left them there, broken and humiliated, and walked back into the night. But as he reached his truck and pulled away, his thoughts were already on the name that had surfaced. Ramon Vasquez, a man who once wore a badge but had built an empire from the shadows after disgrace. Chuck knew what that meant. This was no longer a fight with pawns. It was a war with the man pulling the strings. When he returned home, Gina was waiting on the porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She rushed to him as he stepped out of the truck, her relief spilling into her embrace. "You made sure they'll never forget," she said quietly. "That was the point," Chuck replied, though his eyes looked past her, into the dark horizon, because he knew Vasquez would not hide behind others forever. The war had only just begun, and he would have to step into the lion's den before it was done. The night after the ambush in the park stretched long and heavy, filled with silence that was not restful, but charged with expectation. Chuck had left Miller, Holt, and Salazar broken on the ground, their bravado shattered and their weapons scattered, but his instincts told him the confrontation had only pulled back the curtain on the true danger. The name Ramon Vasquez echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. That name had weight. That name had history. Years earlier, Vasquez had been a police chief, a man who wore the badge not to protect but to profit, until corruption spilled so far into the open that the city expelled him. Yet men like him did not vanish. They simply traded daylight for shadow and rebuilt their power in the dark. Now Vasquez's hands reached through Salazar, through Miller and Holt, poisoning everything they touched. Chuck sat at his desk in the dim glow of his study lamp, the same black notebook open before him. On its pages he had drawn lines between names, circles around threats. The map of a war few would ever see, but which defined the course of his life. Gina entered quietly, her footsteps soft across the wooden floor. She stopped at his side and looked down at the page, her eyes narrowing when she saw Vasquez's name written in bold strokes. She placed a hand gently on Chuck's shoulder. "Is this the man?" she asked. Chuck's jaw tightened. "Yes, he's the one behind it all." "And you're going to him," she said, not as a question but as an acknowledgement of what she already knew. Chuck closed the notebook. His hand rested on hers for a moment. "If I don't, he'll send more. He'll keep coming until he gets what he wants." "And what he wants is us," she whispered, the weight of it clear in her voice. He nodded once. "That's why I end it now." The next evening brought confirmation. A message arrived on the disposable phone Chuck had used before. It was short, a single phrase sent from an anonymous number, but he knew its source. Midnight, warehouse, port. It was an invitation and a challenge, one Vasquez no doubt believed would lead to Chuck's destruction. Chuck read it once, then slid the phone into his pocket. When dusk fell, he drove across town to the old industrial port, a place of rust and shadows, where massive containers loomed like silent towers, and the smell of oil and salt water clung to the air. He parked his truck in darkness, stepping out into the night with nothing more than his baton and the discipline etched into his body by decades of training. He moved through the rows of containers with the silence of a ghost, his boots hardly making a sound on the cracked pavement, his senses stretched outward, reading the air, listening for movement. He saw them before they saw him, men with rifles pacing the perimeter, mercenaries hired by Vasquez. Their movements were undisciplined, cocky. Chuck slipped past the first two, disabling a third with a swift strike to the neck that dropped him silently to the ground. Inside the warehouse, a glow of yellow light spilled from high windows. Chuck crept closer, peering through a gap in the broken glass. The interior was alive with voices, hard and eager. Armed men gathered in small groups, loading magazines, checking blades. And above them, on a platform overlooking it all, stood Ramon Vasquez. Age had touched him, silver in his hair, lines carved deep into his face, but his presence was still one of power. He wore a suit rumpled by long hours, but his posture radiated control. Beside him stood Salazar, nursing his bruises from the park, but still trying to project confidence. "He's finished," Vasquez's voice carried across the warehouse, cold and commanding. "Before sunrise, Norris will be gone. His arrogance will be his grave." Chuck's eyes narrowed. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small stun grenade Javier had given him, a relic from old days neither of them spoke about anymore. He pulled the pin and rolled it through the broken window. A flash of light and sound erupted inside, chaos exploding instantly. Shouts rang out, weapons clattered, men stumbled blindly. Chuck moved. He entered through the side door, his baton snapping out with its metallic click. He struck with precision, disabling wrists, breaking knees, redirecting force. One mercenary raised his rifle only to have it twisted from his hands and turned back into his chest. Another swung a blade, but Chuck's elbow crushed his forearm, sending the knife skittering across the floor. He moved like water, flowing between them, every strike calculated, every movement efficient. Men twice his size crumpled, groaning, their weapons clattering uselessly to the concrete. Salazar tried to run, but Chuck caught him at the exit, slamming him against a steel container. The man gasped, fear widening his eyes. Chuck's grip tightened on his collar. "Where is Vasquez?" Salazar stammered, his voice breaking. "Upstairs. Office." Overlooking the floor. Chuck struck his stomach with a single punch, knocking him unconscious and let his body collapse to the ground. He ascended the metal stairs, each step echoing through the chaos below. At the top, he found the office, its glass walls overlooking the carnage. Inside, Ramon Vasquez waited. A pistol rested casually on the desk before him, his hand hovering close. You don't know who you're dealing with, Vasquez said, his voice low but venomous. Chuck closed the door behind him, his broad figure filling the space. I know exactly who you are, he replied. A coward who hides behind others and threatens women to keep his power. Vasquez's hand twitched toward the pistol, but Chuck was faster. His baton lashed out, striking the weapon away in a blur. The gun clattered across the floor. Vasquez lunged, but Chuck's hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting sharply. With a fluid motion, he slammed the man against the wall, the glass rattling under the impact. This ends tonight, Chuck said, his voice like a verdict. Vasquez gasped, his face contorted with rage. I can pay you. I can make you rich. Chuck's eyes burned cold. I don't want your money. I want your corruption gone. He dragged Vasquez across the office and hurled him onto the desk, the wood groaning under the weight. Then he pulled a length of cord from a crate and tied the man's hands behind his back. Vasquez struggled, cursing, but Chuck's grip was unbreakable. Downstairs, the mercenaries groaned where they had fallen, their strength broken. Chuck hauled Vasquez down the stairs and dropped him among them like a trophy. The once feared chief now bound and powerless. He pulled the disposable phone from his pocket, dialed a number, and when the line picked up, he spoke only 4 words. Here's your story. He set the phone on a crate, the call still open to the journalist he had trusted, then turned and walked out into the night. As he stepped into the cool air of the port, sirens wailed in the distance. Police cruisers and news vans were already on their way, summoned by the open call. By dawn, Ramon Vasquez and his network would be in chains, their faces splashed across every headline, their empire dismantled. Chuck drove home as the horizon blushed with the colors of sunrise. The streets of his neighborhood lay quiet once more, bathed in early light. When he pulled into the driveway, Gina was waiting on the porch. She rushed to him as he stepped out, wrapping her arms around him with trembling relief. It's over, he said softly, holding her close. She looked into his eyes, her voice steady despite the tears. I knew you'd finish it. He kissed her forehead, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the sun rose slowly, painting the world in fragile peace. He knew shadows never vanished completely. They always found new corners to hide in. But for now, the storm had passed, and as long as Chuck Norris stood watch, no darkness would ever claim his home again. If you were shocked by what you just saw, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. Tap like to show your support and share this video with your friends so they can see the truth for themselves. And when you're done, keep watching. The next twist will leave you speechless.